I was sitting on the dusty floor of the Hayes family attic, trying to break the suffocating silence by joking about the foolish marriage pact we had made when we were kids. "Well, we turn 30 next month," I said, offering a casual smile. "If you're still single, I guess we have to go to the courthouse." But Clara didn't laugh. The smile vanished entirely from her face. She reached into the pocket of her oversized cardigan, placed a heavy, intricately carved silver ring on the wooden floorboards between us, and whispered, "I wasn't joking. I've been waiting for 10 years. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just any ring. It was the exact silver band I had hand-carved in my grandfather's workshop a decade ago. The ring I had surrendered to her controlling father in exchange for a secret that forced me to leave town. Before I explain how the lie I told to protect her finally caught up to me, tell me in the comments, if you found out the person you loved left you because your family forced them to, would you forgive them? Or would the lost years be too much to overcome? Leave a like if you believe true love never really forgets, and subscribe for more emotional stories about hidden truths. I had spent exactly 10 years convincing myself that leaving Clara Hayes was the most honorable thing I had ever done. My name is Silas Thorne. I'm a structural engineer based in Chicago, a man who spends his days calculating load-bearing walls, analyzing stress fractures, and ensuring that old, damaged buildings do not collapse under their own weight. I like my profession because numbers and steel do not possess hidden motives. They do not look at you with quiet disappointment, and they do not ask you to explain why you walked away from the only place that ever felt like home. Home used to be Blackwood, a small coastal town in Maine where the air always smelled of pine needles and salt. And for the first 20 years of my life, home was inextricably tied to Clara. We grew up on the same street, separated only by a low stone wall that we spent our childhood climbing over. Clara was the girl with scraped knees and a brilliant, terrifyingly sharp mind. She was the only person who knew I was afraid of deep water, and I was the only person who knew she read architectural magazines instead of the law textbooks her father kept placing on her desk. We made sense together in a way that required no explanation. When we were 10 years old, sitting under the massive oak tree in her backyard, we made a pact. It was the kind of foolish, innocent promise children make when time feels infinite. We promised that if we were both 30 and still unmarried, we would go to the courthouse and marry each other, just so neither of us would ever have to be alone. We sealed it with a handshake and a pinky swear, and then we ran off to chase fireflies. I never forgot it. But as we grew older, the distance between our worlds became impossible to ignore. I was the son of a mechanic struggling to pay off a mountain of medical debt after my mother's illness. Clara was the sole heiress to the Hayes estate, daughter of Arthur Hayes, a man who owned half the commercial real estate in Blackwood and viewed people strictly as investments or liabilities. When we were 20, I realized I was dangerously in love with her. I spent 3 months in my grandfather's metal shop, working late into the night, melting down scrap silver to forge a ring. I carved a delicate pattern of ivy leaves into the band, mirroring the vines that climbed the stone wall between our houses. I planned to give it to her. I planned to ask her to choose me, despite the bank accounts, despite her father, despite the terrifying reality that I had nothing to offer her but my hands and my heart. I never gave her the ring. Instead, I disappeared. I packed my bags, moved to Chicago, and spent the next decade turning myself into a man who did not need anyone. But a week ago, Arthur Hayes passed away unexpectedly, and Clara, who had inherited an estate heavily burdened with hidden debts and structural issues, contacted my engineering firm to assess the property before she liquidated it. She didn't ask for me specifically. She only asked for the best structural analyst the firm had. When I saw the address on the intake form, I could have handed the file to a colleague. I should have. Instead, I booked a flight to Maine. That is how I found myself sitting on the dusty, uneven floorboards of the Hayes family attic on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, pretending the air between us wasn't thick with 10 years of unspoken grief. Clara looked different, but fundamentally the same. The wild, untamed energy of her youth had been refined into a quiet, formidable grace. She wore an oversized gray cardigan, her dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck. We had spent the last 3 hours sorting through boxes of her father's old records, maintaining a polite, professional distance. We talked about roof joists. We talked about property taxes. We carefully avoided talking about us. The silence in the attic was heavy, broken only by the steady drumming of the coastal rain against the slanted roof. It was suffocating. I needed to break the tension before it broke me. I leaned back against a stack of wooden crates, forcing a casual, easy smile onto my face. You know, looking at all these legal documents reminds me, I said, aiming for a light, teasing tone. We turn 30 next month. According to the airtight legal contract we established under the oak tree, if you're still single, I guess we have to go to the courthouse? I expected her to roll her eyes. I expected her to laugh, call me an idiot, and throw a crumpled piece of paper at me, just like she would have when we were 20. Clara did not laugh. She went entirely still. The file folder in her hands slipped from her grasp, landing softly on the dusty floor. She slowly lifted her head, and the look in her dark eyes stripped away every defense I had built over the last decade. It wasn't amusement. It was a raw, devastating honesty that made the breath catch in my throat. I wasn't joking, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. She reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan. Her hand was trembling slightly, a tiny involuntary tremor that I noticed only because I had spent my entire life paying attention to her. She pulled her hand out and placed a small silver object on the floorboards directly between us. It was a ring. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violent, sickening force. The metal was slightly tarnished from age, but the intricate pattern of ivy leaves carved into the band was unmistakable. It was my ring. The ring I had made. The ring I had surrendered to her father in his immaculate, mahogany-paneled office 10 years ago, on the worst night of my life. Clara, I choked out, the words scraping against my throat like broken glass. I stared at the silver band as if it were a ghost. Where did you get that? I found it in my father's personal safe 2 days ago, Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, the kind of calm that comes when a person has cried until there are no tears left. It was in a sealed envelope, along with a copy of a cashier's check made out to your mother's hospital. The room spun. The rain outside suddenly sounded deafening. 10 years ago, Arthur Hayes had cornered me. He knew about my mother's crippling medical bills. He knew the bank was foreclosing on our house. And he knew I was holding a silver ring, preparing to ask his daughter to tie her brilliant, wealthy future to a boy drowning in debt. Arthur had offered me a brutal trade. He would anonymously pay off my mother's entire medical debt, saving her life and our home. In exchange, I had to hand over the ring, pack my bags, and leave Blackwood without a word of explanation to Clara. I had to let her believe I simply didn't love her enough to stay. He called it protecting his investment. I called it the price of my mother's survival. I thought I had taken that secret to the grave. I thought Clara would go on to live a beautiful, unburdened life, hating me just enough to move forward. Clara looked at my pale, shocked face. She did not yell. She did not demand an apology. Instead, she asked the one question I had spent a decade running from. "You sold our future, Silas," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Why didn't you think I was strong enough to help you fight for it?" The question hung in the dusty air of the attic, heavier than the rotting wooden beams supporting the roof above us. Why didn't you think I was strong enough to help you fight for it? I looked at Clara, at the intricate silver ring resting on the floorboards between us, and felt the last 10 years of my carefully constructed life fracture. I'd spent a decade building skyscrapers, analyzing structural limits, and hiding behind the safety of logic. But there was no logic that could shield me from the raw, devastating honesty in her eyes. "Because you were 20 years old, Clara," I said, my voice coming out rough and hollow. "You were 20, and you had a brilliant, unburdened future mapped out for you. I was a mechanic's son, drowning in $500,000 of medical debt. The bank had already drafted the foreclosure papers for our house. We had 2 weeks before they changed the locks. My mother needed a specialized surgery that insurance refused to cover, and I had exactly $42 in my savings account." Clara remained perfectly still, her hands resting in the pockets of her oversized cardigan. "Your father didn't just offer to pay for the surgery," I continued, forcing myself to hold her gaze, refusing to let myself look away from the pain I had caused. "He sat behind his mahogany desk, locked the door, and told me that if I tried to stay, he would use his influence to ensure no bank in the state would grant me a loan. He would let my mother die, and he would let me watch. The only way he would save her was if I gave him the ring I was making for you, packed my bags, and left that night without saying a single word of goodbye." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't cry. The tears that had been shining in her eyes slowly dried into something much harder, much more formidable. She reached down, picked up the silver ring, and held it tightly in her palm. "So you made a martyr of yourself," she whispered. "I made the only choice I had to keep my mother alive," I shot back, the old defensiveness rising in my chest. "I'm not angry that you chose your mother's life, Silas," Clara said, her voice cutting through the drumming rain with quiet, devastating precision. "If you had told me, I would have begged you to choose her. I'm angry because you let my father convince you that I was a fragile little girl who needed to be shielded from the ugly parts of the world. You thought you were protecting me, but all you did was leave me alone in a house with a man who viewed people as assets to be managed." The words struck me like a physical blow. For a decade, I had worn my departure like a badge of honor. I had told myself I was the tragic hero who sacrificed his own happiness for her safety. But looking at Clara now, at the quiet, fiercely intelligent woman she had become, I realized the ugliest truth of all. I hadn't left just to save my mother. I had left because Arthur Hayes made me feel exactly like what I secretly feared I was: a poor boy who wasn't enough for his daughter. I had let his prejudice validate my own insecurities. Before I could find the words to apologize, the storm outside surged. A violent gust of coastal wind rattled the attic windows, and a sharp, sudden drip echoed in the room. Rainwater began leaking through the slanted ceiling, splashing directly onto a stack of Arthur's leather-bound estate ledgers. The professional instinct kicked in before the emotional one could completely paralyze me. "The roof flashing is compromised," I muttered, stripping off my tailored jacket and tossing it onto a dry chair. I moved quickly, dragging a heavy plastic storage bin across the uneven floorboards to catch the water, then pulled a heavy-duty flashlight from my work bag. Clara didn't freeze. She didn't wait for instructions. She stepped right beside me, holding back the stacks of files and using an old canvas tarp to cover the remaining cardboard boxes. We moved around each other in the tight, dusty space with a rhythm that felt terrifyingly familiar. It was exactly like being kids again, building wooden forts in the woods behind her house, anticipating each other's movements without speaking a word. The natural, effortless synchronization between us hadn't died. It had just been waiting in the dark. I stood on a sturdy wooden crate, aiming my flashlight at the rotting joist above us. "The structural integrity of this section is gone," I said, tracing the water line with my hand. "The timber has been rotting for years. Your father never had this inspected?" "My father only maintained the parts of the house that people could see," Clara replied quietly from below me. I looked down. She was standing so close that the faint, familiar scent of vanilla and rain drifted up to me. Her dark eyes were fixed on my face, not the leaking roof. I stepped down from the crate, suddenly hyper-aware of the fact that we were entirely alone in an isolated attic. The space between us was less than a foot. I could see the pulse beating softly at the base of her throat. "I can patch it temporarily," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper as I struggled to maintain my professional distance. "But the whole estate is going to need a massive structural overhaul before you can put it on the market. It's going to cost a fortune to liquidate this place, Clara." She looked down at the canvas tarp she was holding. "I'm not liquidating the estate, Silas." I frowned, wiping dust from my hands. "The intake form at my firm said you were assessing the property for a commercial sale." "I lied," she said, her voice entirely steady. The single word hung in the cold air. I stared at her, trying to process the shift in the conversation. "What do you mean you lied?" Clara let go of the tarp and took a step toward me, crossing the last remaining boundary between us. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the silver ring she had placed there. "When my father died, I found out the estate was drowning in hidden debt," she said softly. "The board of his company assumed I would just sell it to commercial developers and walk away. They wanted to turn this property into luxury condos. But this house, this town, it's my home. I want to save it. I want to convert the property into a community arts foundation." "Then why did you contact a corporate engineering firm in Chicago?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You could have hired any local structural analyst in Maine to assess the building." Clara looked up at me, stripping away the last remnants of the polite, professional facade we had worn for the past 3 hours. "Because I didn't want a local analyst, Silas," she whispered, her eyes shining in the dim light of the flashlight. "I saw your name on your firm's partner roster 6 months ago. I knew my father's health was failing. I knew what I was going to inherit. And I knew that when the time came, I needed an excuse to bring you back to this house." The breath left my lungs. She hadn't called my firm by accident. The entire assessment, the flights, the legal forms, it had all been a deliberate, meticulously orchestrated plan to pull me back into her orbit. "You requested me," I breathed, unable to hide the profound awe in my voice. I spent 10 years wondering if the boy who carved this ring still existed inside the man who designed skyscrapers and never looks back, Clara said, her voice trembling just enough to betray how much the admission cost her. "I needed to know if you were just a ghost I was holding on to, or if the man standing in my attic was finally brave enough to stay." She didn't ask for an answer. She simply turned and walked toward the attic stairs, leaving me standing in the dark, listening to the rain, and realizing that the woman I thought I had broken was actually the one holding the pieces of my life together. The echo of Clara's footsteps faded down the narrow attic stairs, leaving me alone in the dark with the steady drumming of the coastal rain against the roof. For 10 years, I had built my identity around the belief that I was a martyr. I had convinced myself that walking away from the only woman I ever loved was the ultimate act of protection. But standing there, listening to the rain dripping into the plastic bin I had just pushed across the floor, the truth stripped away every excuse I had ever invented. Clara had not needed to be protected from poverty or from a mechanic's son with too much debt. She had needed someone to stand beside her and fight the man who viewed her life as a corporate asset. And I had walked away. I grabbed my work bag and my flashlight, descending the creaking stairs with a new, terrifying clarity. I did not know how to fix a decade of absence, but I knew exactly how to fix a failing foundation. When I reached the ground floor, the grand foyer was entirely dark except for the amber glow spilling from the formal dining room. I walked toward the light and stopped in the doorway. Clara was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table, surrounded by her father's leather-bound ledgers. The silver ring I had carved 10 years ago sat quietly near her right hand. Before I could speak, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the silent house. Clara's shoulders stiffened. She glanced at the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was almost 8 in the evening. She stood up, smoothing the front of her oversized cardigan, the vulnerable woman from the attic instantly replaced by the formidable heiress Arthur Hayes had trained her to be. I followed her to the entryway. When she opened the heavy oak door, cold wind and rain swept into the foyer. Standing on the porch was Victor Sterling, the senior partner of the legal firm that managed the Hayes Trust, accompanied by a man in a sleek charcoal overcoat I recognized immediately, Grant Mercer, a commercial developer known for bulldozing historic properties across the East Coast. "Clara," Sterling said, his tone dripping with the kind of polite condescension older men use when they intend to take something from you. "I apologize for the late hour, but Grant and I needed to finalize the liquidation timeline before the board meeting tomorrow morning." Clara did not step aside to let them in. "I told the board yesterday that I am not selling the estate, Victor. The house is being transferred into a community arts foundation." Grant Mercer gave a soft, pitying laugh. "A beautiful sentiment, Clara, but entirely unrealistic. The board has already reviewed the preliminary assessments. The house has severe structural rot. The roof is compromised. Bringing this building up to commercial code would drain the remainder of your liquid trust. As the executors of your father's estate, we cannot allow you to bankrupt yourself over a childhood attachment." Sterling pulled a thick legal folder from his briefcase and held it out to her. "Sign the commercial sale agreement tonight, Clara. Let Grant's company take the burden off your hands. It is what your father wanted." Clara stared at the folder. For a fraction of a second, I saw the immense, suffocating weight of her father's ghost pressing down on her shoulders. For her entire life, men in expensive suits had stood in this exact foyer, telling her what she could not do, what she was not strong enough to handle, and what Arthur Hayes had decided for her. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and moved directly to Clara's side. "The house is settling, Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the damp air with absolute, unyielding authority. "It is not failing. There is a profound difference, though I wouldn't expect a lawyer and a real estate flipper to know it." Both men recoiled in surprise. Sterling's eyes darted over my casual work clothes and the dust covering my jeans. "And who exactly are you?" "My name is Silas Thorne," I said. "I'm a senior structural engineer and a junior partner at Vanguard Architectural in Chicago, the firm Clara hired to conduct the official assessment." Grant Mercer's arrogant smile thinned. "Ah, the hired help. Well, Mr. Thorne, I'm sure you'll agree that the water damage in the upper joists alone is enough to condemn the property for public use. The water damage is localized to the secondary flashing, I countered, crossing my arms. The load-bearing walls are built from old-growth coastal cedar. They are practically indestructible. The foundation hasn't shifted a single inch in 80 years. I will be submitting my official report to the State Preservation Board tomorrow morning, certifying that Hartwell Estate is entirely structurally sound and fully eligible for historical grant funding. Sterling's face turned an ugly shade of red. You are interfering in private family trust matters, Mr. Thorne. I will have your firm pull you off this assessment by tomorrow afternoon. You can try, I said, staring him down with the kind of cold, unblinking certainty I had spent 10 years building. But I own 12% of that firm, and my signature is already on the paperwork. The house is not a liability, and it is no longer for sale. I looked at Clara. She was not looking at the lawyers, she was looking at me, her dark eyes wide and shining with something that looked terrifyingly like hope. You heard the engineer, Clara said, her voice completely steady now, laced with a quiet, lethal grace. The property is secure. The Arts Foundation is moving forward. And if you ever show up at my home uninvited again, Victor, I will have the State Bar Association review the last 10 years of my father's financial ledgers. Sterling opened his mouth to argue, but Grant put a hand on his arm, recognizing a lost war when he saw one. They turned and walked back out into the freezing rain. Clara shut the heavy oak door, locking the deadbolt with a sharp, echoing click. Suddenly, the massive house was quiet again. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation slowly faded, leaving me alone in the foyer with the woman I had just scorched the earth to defend. Clara turned around and leaned her back against the door. She let out a long, shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline left her system. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Yes, I did, I said, stepping closer, leaving only a few feet of space between us. 10 years ago, I stood in this house and let a man in a suit tell me you were too fragile to fight your own battles. I promised myself I would never let anyone make you feel small again. Clara looked up at me, a single tear spilling over her eyelashes. She didn't wipe it away. I requested your firm because I wanted to know if the boy who carved my ring was still alive somewhere inside the man who left me, she said softly. But I didn't expect you to burn a bridge with my father's board for me. I would burn the whole city down if you asked me to, I admitted, the confession slipping out before fear could stop it. But you didn't need me to save you, Clara. You saved this house yourself. I'm just here to make sure the walls hold up while you build your life inside it. She smiled, a beautiful, devastatingly real smile that made my chest physically ache. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver ivy leaf ring. She held it in her palm, looking at the tarnished metal. We turn 30 next month, she said, her voice dropping into a quiet, intimate register. I believe we made a legally binding agreement under an apple tree. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the ring, then at the brilliant, resilient woman standing in front of me. I didn't offer a polite, safe answer. I didn't hide behind guilt or the past. I reached out and gently took the ring from her palm. The paperwork was a little informal, I whispered, my fingers brushing against hers. And I don't want to marry you because we made a promise when we were 10. I don't want to marry you because you need an engineer, or because I feel guilty for leaving. I stepped into her space, my free hand coming up to cup her face. She leaned into my touch, her breath catching as I brushed my thumb across her cheekbone. "I want to marry you," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "because you are the only home I have ever actually wanted. Because you never stopped fighting for us, even when I did. And because I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I am brave enough to stay." Clara's eyes searched mine, looking for any trace of the boy who had run away. She found only the man who had finally come back. "Then stay," she whispered. When I kissed her, there was no hesitation, no fear of being caught, and no ghosts hovering in the hallway. It was a kiss built on a decade of waiting, on letters never sent, and on the profound, shattering relief of finally telling the truth. I slid the silver ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. We did not fix 10 years of absence in a single night. Love, I learned, is not a magical eraser that wipes away all the pain of the past. Love is the painstaking, daily work of consistency. I flew back to Chicago the next week, not to escape, but to pack my apartment. I transferred to a fully remote position and opened a small, independent architectural branch in Blackwood. Clara and I spent the next year side by side, wearing dust masks and work boots, tearing out rotting drywall, reinforcing cedar beams, and transforming the suffocating mansion of Arthur Hayes into a bright, open community center filled with sunlight and art. We didn't have a grand, expensive wedding. We didn't need an audience to validate what we had survived. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon in October, exactly 1 month after we both turned 30, we walked into the local courthouse. Clara wore a simple white dress. I wore a suit that didn't have sawdust on it. We signed the papers, held hands, and promised each other that we would never let silence make our decisions again. Years ago, I believed that love meant sacrificing your own heart to keep someone else safe from the ugly realities of the world. I thought carrying the burden alone made me honorable. But as I stood on the newly restored porch of the Blackwood Arts Foundation, watching my wife laugh with a group of local children learning to paint, I finally understood the truth. Love is not a secret you keep to protect someone. Love is the absolute, terrifying courage to stand in the light, tell the truth, and trust that the person holding your hand is strong enough to weather the storm with you. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe for more emotional romance stories about hidden feelings, second chances, and the courage to speak the truth. If you stayed until the end, comment, "Brave enough to stay," so I know you believe that real love is always worth the wait.